Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always an honor to speak in Greece about cultural properties. Greece is the root and the origin of Western civilization. It's also an honor to speak in Greece about restitution of cultural properties, as Greece is involved in the most significant and complex issue of restitution relating to the Parthenon marbles. And it's also an honor to speak under the control of Mrs. Cyrene Stamatudi, who wrote an excellent book on restitution of cultural properties and several articles on the Parthenon marbles. And together on the same panel with Toshi Kono, with whom I shared many experiences at UNESCO. So, since a long time, as regards my time limit, I need 8 hours, as I am a very prolix and sedentary speaker, but this time I will make an exception and I will try to limit my intervention to 45 minutes. So, cultural properties are removed, exported, for different reasons, some legal and some illegal. For example, sale or transfer of the residence of the owner, or looting in time of war, or theft, or clandestine excavation, or illegal export. And we have national legislation in most countries as regards the export of cultural properties, and we have basically 2 different approaches. One is a restrictive approach based on the concept of the public interest in the preservation and enjoyment of cultural properties. For example, in Italy and in other countries, I understand also Greece, the legislation provides that any export of cultural properties should be previously declared to the state, and the state, within a certain period of time, has a right of preemption. It can buy the property at the same price at which the property is sold, or at the value of the property. And if the property is not declared, if it is illegally exported, the state has a right of confiscation. It becomes the owner of the property. And another principle that we have is that the state is the owner of all properties which have been found underground or in the sea, and the finder or the owner of the land has only the right to get a reward, in Italy corresponding to 1/4 of the value of the property. In other countries, the legislation is different. We have an approach which is based on the concept of free market of properties. There is no distinction between cultural properties and other kinds of properties. For example, in the United States, in principle, the export and import of cultural properties is free, unless there is special legislation or a treaty which prevents the export or import. And the owner of the land or the finder in the sea has the right to become the owner of the cultural property if no other owner is known. So the approach in national legislation is different, very different. And what about international law? Do we have legal provisions in international law relating to the export of cultural properties. It is clear that not all the cultural properties which have been exported should be returned, but it is also evident that not all cultural properties which have been exported should be retained by the state of destination. So what is the threshold between return and retention? And in international law we have treaties, multilateral treaties and also bilateral treaties on the export of cultural properties. We have, for example, the UNESCO Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Properties. It has been adopted in Paris in 1970. It is a very successful convention because 134 states are today parties to it, both states of origin and states of destination of cultural properties. But I have no time to enter into details. It is a treaty which has some gaps, some shortcomings, some points of ambiguity. For example, it is not completely clear whether the treaty applies to properties coming from illegal excavations. And we have also a UNIDROIT. UNIDROIT is another international organization for the unification of private law, Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects. It was concluded in Rome in 1995. It is complementary to the first convention and more effective than the first convention in ensuring the return of stolen or illegally exported cultural properties, but so far only 41 states are parties to the second convention, and the great majority of them are states of origin of cultural properties. And the treaties in question are, as every treaty, applicable only in the relationship between parties to the treaty. So they are not applicable to non-parties, and they do not have retroactive application. In any case, they apply only to movements of cultural properties which have taken place after the entry into force of the treaty for the states concerned. So there are many cases, starting from the Parthenon marbles, which do not fall under the application of existing treaties. In this case, we have in international law customary international law rules which have not been written in any treaty but are the result of international practice. So what does it say, customary international law, for the return of cultural properties which do not fall under the application of any treaty, question mark. And I will give you mostly some examples taken from the Italian practice, not only because I am Italian and I like my country, but also because Italy is interesting, because on the one side, Italy has become the victim of many illegal exports of cultural properties, including in recent times. But on the other side, Italy has also looted other countries, so could be under an obligation to return cultural properties to other countries. So what is the balance? Italy should be coherent in dealing with this kind of questions. And so we can ask a historical question. when was it the first time in which some states said that there is a legal obligation to return cultural properties taken away from the country of origin? When did it happen for the first time? It was in 1815, after the fall of Napoleon, and Napoleon had the mandate in his military campaigns in Europe, the mandate from the French authority to take possession of cultural properties from conquered countries in order to supply the great museum of world civilization which should be established in Paris. It was called at the beginning the Musée Napoléon. Now it is the Musée du Louvre. And in Italy, when he went to Italy, in certain cases the French troops looted cultural properties without any agreement with the defeated countries. In other cases, the French, they concluded treaties with the Italian states. At that time, Italy as a single country did not exist. We had different states in the territory of Italy. For example, we had a treaty in 1796 with the Papal State, according to which the Pope was bound to deliver to France 100 cultural properties and 500 manuscripts at the choice of the French authorities. And similar states were concluded with the state of Parma, with the state of Modena, with the Republic of Venice. In my first picture, you see it on the screen. Maybe you don't see, and you see it. And you see an engravings of that time with Napoleon in Rome, with the Pope at the balcony, who is very much concerned about the looting by the French of antiquities from Rome. And at the time of the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the Pope had the good idea of appointing, I would say, the most celebrated artist of his time as an ambassador to France with the mission to recover the cultural properties which had been removed from Rome to Paris. The artist was this man, Antonio Canova, the artist who represents the neoclassical style. You see here a self-portrait of Antonio Canova. The neoclassical style is not imitation of Greek classical style, is recreation of Greek classical style. And Canova, he was born very poor in a village near to Venice. He was very lucky because he found people who trusted him, and he had the possibility to move to Venice, and he became the sculptor of the noble families of Venice, of the Republic of Venice, and then he moved to Rome, and he became the sculptor of the Pope, of kings, of many influent people, including Napoleon and the family of Napoleon. This is a bust of Napoleon made by Canova. This is one of the most well-known neoclassical sculptors. It is Venus, but in fact it is the sister of Napoleon, Paolina Bonaparte, as Venus. You can find it at the Galleria Borghese in Rome. So Canova was appointed as ambassador. He didn't want to do this, but to engage himself in diplomatic activities. He was a sculptor, but in order to follow the desire of the Pope and in consideration of the importance of his mission, he accepted, and he went to Paris. And we know from his memories that he had many legal concerns. How can I do? All the properties have been removed under an international treaty. What should I say? That the treaty is void and that the treaty has been terminated. He was not able to find any legal reason. But he was very intelligent. He understood that the question was not a legal question. It was a moral and political question. He had the support of a booklet written by a French scholar in 1796. At the time of the looting by Napoleon, there was a French scholar. His first name was Antoine Chrysostom. His last name was Quatremer de Quincy. And he wrote a booklet, which for the first time it was published in 1796, and it was reprinted in Rome in 1815 under the desire of Antonio Canova. And the booklet is very interesting. His title, translated from French to English, means Letters on the Damage which could be caused to arts and science by the removal of cultural properties from Italy. And in the booklet, if I can turn the page, I cannot turn, yes. In the booklet, Quatremer developed several interesting concepts, among them two. One is written here, diviser, c'est détruire. To destroy, to divide is to destroy. Is if you remove from a monument some pieces of the monument, it is the same as if you destroy the monument. The concept of the integrity of cultural properties. If the integrity is lost, all the information that a property can give is also lost. So it is important to preserve the integrity of cultural properties, to leave the cultural properties which have been created in Rome, to leave them in Rome. And then there is also another interesting concept in Quatremer de Quincy, that cultural properties are different from any other kind of properties. They represent the culture and the spirit of one country. So the country of origin is entitled to adopt legislation preventing the removal of cultural properties. Cultural properties are different from oranges or today cars or any other property because they represent the spirit of one country. So Canova went there. He had the moral principles developed by Quatremer de Quincy, and he was able to get the political support of the winners, England, Austria, and Prussia, and the British authorities, in particular the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lord Castlereagh, made this statement that to loot defeated countries is contrary to every principle of justice and to the usages of modern warfare. So this is the first time in history that a state stated that it is contrary to law to loot defeated countries in war. Up to this moment, it was a common practice dating back from the ancient Romans to loot defeated countries. But in 1815, for the first time, it has been stated by an important state, the United Kingdom, that we have an obligation. And the British said that they had the possibility to loot the looter, to loot the properties looted by Napoleon, but they preferred to give them back to the defeated countries. So Canova was able to get back masterpieces such as the statue of Apollon of the Belvedere, which is now back in the Vatican Museum, such as the Laocoon, which is now back to the Vatican Museum. Both of them were excavated in Rome. The Laocoon is an example of Hellenistic art, and also some very important paintings, such as Transfiguration by Raphael, or the Deposition by Caravaggio. All of them were looted by the French and given back. Canova was able to get back 70% of the cultural properties, more or less 70 out of the 100 cultural properties. What was impossible to get back were the properties which had been transferred from Paris to other French cities. And in general, also other masterpieces were given back by France to Italy, to different Italian states. For example, the horses of St. Mark were given back to Venice. In the meantime, Venice was included in the state of Austria. And this is an interesting case because in the Middle Ages, the Venetians themselves looted the horses from Constantinople, and I think that they are still claimed back by Turkey from Italy. And this was not possible to have it back. It's a big, wonderful painting by Veronese, The Wedding of Cana, and still it is in the Louvre Museum in France. And also it was not possible to have back this Madonna by Andrea Mantegna, which had been removed from a church in Mantua. So that was the first time. And then the principle of restitution was still confirmed after World War II, after the lootings by the Germans. Hitler was somehow an expert in art. He failed twice to pass the exam for admission at the Academy of Art in Vienna when he was young. If he had succeeded, perhaps the history of the 20th century would have been different. Marshal Goering was a great collector of art. And Hitler planned to open a great Führer museum in the city of Linz, close to the village where he was born. More or less the same design of the French, a great museum of human civilization. So the Germans used to loot, to remove cultural properties from the occupied territories, France, and in the East, Poland, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and also Italy after 1943, when there was an armistice between Italy and the Allied powers, and part of Italy was occupied by the German troops. For example, what was, you see in this picture, the looting of cultural properties by the Germans from Italy, some paintings on the way to Germany, and this Danae by Titian was looted. It was looted by the Goering division and given as a present to Marshal Goering for his birthday. And this is a wonderful female portrait by Parmigianino coming from Naples. It was the destination of this painting was a Führer museum of Hitler. So after the war, many paintings were found in the German warehouses, and in the peace treaty between Italy and the Allied powers concluded in 1947, we find a very interesting provision that identifiable property of Italy and Italian nationals removed by force or duress from Italian territory by German forces shall be eligible for restitution. So Germany, which was not a party to the treaty, was bound to return to Italy. So a defeated country was bound to return to another defeated country all the properties that the former had looted from the latter. And we find, of course, in the peace of treaty other provisions which bind Italy to return cultural properties which had been looted by Italy to occupied countries. We have specific provisions relating to Ethiopia, relating to Yugoslavia, and relating also to Greece. And Italy was capable to put forward a broad interpretation of the provision, Article 77, relating to the return from Germany to Italy. The provision says properties removed by force or duress. But there were also other cultural properties, for example, the Discobolus, and it is a well-known sculpture, more or less a symbol also of the Olympic Games, especially the Olympic Games which were held in Rome in 1960. And this was not looted, but it was sold in 1938 by the private Italian family, the family Lancilotti, which was the owner of the sculpture, to Hitler. So Hitler wanted the sculpture for his future museum, and he sent a representative to Rome in order to negotiate the sale of the Discobolus. And according to the Italian legislation, you need the authorization by the state, and the Minister of Culture denied the authorization. But we had an intervention of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ciano. We had the intervention of the President of the Council of Ministers, Mussolini, and they both made pressure in order to get the authorization. And finally, the authorization was granted. In this case, the sculpture had not been removed during the war, and it had not been looted, it had been sold. But Italy was able enough to persuade the Allied powers that also this kind of sales were made under pressure by German authorities. So Italy was able to have the sculpture back. It was confiscated, not given back to the private family, and now it is the property of the state, and it is exhibited in the Museo Nazionale Romano in Rome. So for the second time in history, we had the confirmation that cultural properties should be returned in certain cases. The first case is when they have been taken away by the winner and at the expense of the defeated country. When the idea is when we have the exploitation of the weakness of another subject. It is immoral, and consequently it is also illegal to retain cultural properties which have been removed exploiting the weakness of another country. And when we have the weakness of another country, not only in cases of military occupation, but also in cases of colonial occupation. So we have several examples of restitution of properties which had been looted during the colonial period. An example is the Aksum obelisk. It was taken away by the Italians in 1937 after the aggression by Italy of Ethiopia. And the idea of the Italians was that Italy was the same as the ancient Roman Empire. So as the ancient Romans, they used to loot cultural properties, so also Italy was entitled to loot cultural properties. The Aksum obelisk was in the city, the holy city of Aksum in Ethiopia. It was broken by an earthquake in 3 big pieces, and in these pictures we see the arrival of the obelisk in Rome in 37. Incidentally, we have a pyramid also in Rome, as you can see in the picture. And it was put, you see in the picture, in front of a building. The building was intended to become the headquarters of the Italian Ministry of Colonies. Now it is the building of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. So it is a modern building. So in the picture you have the idea of a monument put out of its proper context. What is a connection between an Ethiopian obelisk and a modern building in Rome. No connection at all. So after many discussions, and despite of the Treaty of Peace, which put forward an obligation of restitution, only in 2005 Italy agreed to return the obelisk to Aksum and to pay the expense not only for the restitution but also for the re-erection on the place of the obelisk. And in the picture you can see the ceremony for the inauguration of the obelisk in Aksum. But Italy gave back to Libya, before the present situation of war and confusion in Libya, two wonderful Venuses which were taken away by the Italians after the colonization by the Italians of Libya, two sculptures. One is the Venus of Cyrene, a wonderful statue of Hellenistic age, which was excavated in Cyrene. And here you can see the picture of the restitution of the Venus by the former Italian Prime Minister and the Colonel Gheddafi of Libya. Incidentally speaking of, that's a very sad picture, because speaking about Gheddafi, every human being has a right to have a trial and cannot be lynched. So also Gheddafi had the right, whatever he had committed, to be judged by a tribunal. And the second Venus, which was given back by Italy to Libya, is the Venus of Leptis Magna. It was given as a gift by Italo Balbo, who was the governor of Libya, to his friend Marshal Goering. It was found in Germany, given back by Germany to Italy, and given back by Italy to Libya. So when we have the exploitation of the weakness of another country, of course, in recent time we have restitution of cultural properties which have been removed because of theft and illegal excavations. Very interesting are the agreement concluded in 2006 and later by Italy with American museums, which exhibited the artifacts of dubious provenance and in fact illegally excavated in Italy, in order to avoid the cost and the uncertain outcome of a litigation. Italy agreed with the American Museum, which also had a sort of moral obligation to preserve their reputation as serious cultural institution. Agreements. Italy waives its rights to bring civil and criminal actions for the restitution of the cultural properties, gets the return of the cultural property, and in exchange Italy engages itself to give on loan other cultural properties of equivalent value for a certain period of time to the foreign institution. And of course, the agreements build a cooperation in restoration, in exhibitions between Italy and the American institution. Such agreements were concluded with the Metropolitan Museum of Art of New York, with the Museum of Fine Art of Boston, with the Princeton University Art Museum, with the Paul Getty Museum, with the Cleveland Museum of Art, with the Dallas Museum of Art, also with a Japanese institution, the Tokyo Fuji Art Museum, and understand that also Greece has concluded some similar agreements with American Museum. What was given back? Can we switch to the second file? I ask the technician if it is possible. From the Metropolitan Museum, Italy was able to get the Euphonious Crater. The Euphonious Crater is simply wonderful. It has been painted by Euphonious, one of the most celebrated artists of red paintings, active between 520 and 470 before Christ. It represents Hermes, which supervises the transport of the corpse of the Trojan hero Sarpedon, killed in battle by Hypnos, sleep, and Thanatos, death. And on the other side, if it is possible to switch to the second, not possible. Yes, on the other side, we have some warriors preparing them for the battle. So in 71, the Euphonious Crater was completely unknown, and it was exhibited by the Metropolitan Museum. There was a great interest for this new acquisition by the museum, and the director of the Metropolitan Museum was asked some questions by the press, some obvious question. First question, how much did you pay it? And the answer was $1 million and a collection of ancient coins also in addition. The second question was, from where does it come? And the answer was that it was owned since immemorial time by an Armenian family who lived in Beirut, Lebanon, and was forced by the civil war in Lebanon to move to Australia. The family needed money and decided to sell the vase on the market. And it was bought by an American antiquarian, Mr. Hecht, who sold the vase to the Metropolitan Museum. It was difficult to believe in such a story. Why not a family of Eskimos forced to move from the North Pole to Florida? But there was no evidence. Of course, there were many suspicions in Italy that the vase had been illegally excavated in Italy. Euphonious was a great Greek artist living in Athens, but it was customary at that time that the best Greek vases were exported to Italy, were sold to the Etruscans, and the Etruscans used to put the vases in the tombs when the man who was the owner of the vase died. And then something happened. An antiquarian who was suspected to be involved in the illegal market unfortunately died in a car accident. the police went on the place and tried to find the identity of the man, and they took the valet from the corpse of the man, and they found a document, but they also found this piece of paper with some interesting names. Here you have the name of Hecht written with a mistake, and here you have the name of Medici written with, and Medici is an Italian antiquarian involved in the illegal chain of illegal market. In fact, the piece of papers represents the chain of all the people involved in the illegal market, starting from the illegal excavators, tombaroli in Italian, to the middlemen, to those in charge of the transportation, and to the antiquarians in charge of the sale. And so some evidence came out. As it was known that Mr. Medici had a warehouse in the free port of the airport of Geneva in Switzerland, the Italian police got the permission from the Swiss authority, and both the Italian and the Swiss police made an inspection in the warehouse composed of 3 rooms, and they found a museum of more than 3,000 antiquities from the illegal market. And in the 3rd room there was an archive, a very complete documentation of all the sales, including some pictures. Here you can see the picture of Mr. Medici together with the Euphonious Crater when it was exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum, and of course an invoice was also found. So the Italian authorities found complete evidence of the illegal trafficking. And it was very, very difficult, I would say impossible, for the Metropolitan Museum to insist on the story of the Armenian family. So all the evidence was found. Here is the picture of the last antiquarian who sold the vase, Mr. Hecht, also with the at the Metropolitan Museum with the Euphonious Crater. And he imported the vase legally into the United States. At that time, the import, now we have an agreement, a bilateral agreement between Italy and the United States, but at that time all imports were free. Just you have to declare to the customs the import and the value, and Mr. Hecht declared that the value was $1 million. He made a true declaration, and as the origin he declared Switzerland, because the flight came from Switzerland, the warehouse was in Switzerland, and it is said that when he went to the customs at the Kennedy Airport in New York, the custom official asked him, please open the box that you have with you. He opened the box, and the custom official said to Mr. Hecht, I do not know anything about Greek vases, but I know that you have a wonderful item with you. Please enter into the United States, because it was perfectly legal to import any kind of antiquities into the United States. And now, as my time has completely elapsed, I will show also other wonderful items which come from the agreements concluded by Italy with the American museums. This is a wonderful sculpture, the Trapezophoros, that's a Greek name. It is a support for a ritual table that represents two griffons attacking a deer. And it comes from the Paul Getty Museum, illegally excavated in the region of Puglia in Italy. Incidentally, the Euphonious Crater was illegally excavated in the city of Cerveteri from an Etruscan tomb, as it is clearly showed by the documentation found in the warehouse of Mr. Medici. Then other item, here you see Mr. Medici with the griffons at the Getty Museum, a picture taken by Mr. Medici and in the archives of Mr. Medici. Here you have a number of silver artifacts, the treasure of Morgantina. Morgantina is a Greek city in the center of the island of Sicily, also illegally excavated and given back from the Paul Getty Museum. Here you see the Venus of Morgantina in the Getty Museum, cut in 3 pieces, illegally exported and given back to Italy. Here it is difficult to see. It is the statue of the wife of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, coming from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. His is the visage of a divinity, probably, that was with an antiquarian in England and also illegally exported from Italy and given back by the antiquarian himself. But also other artifacts have not been found. This is very interesting. It's a sarcophagus of a couple, a husband of a wife. Maybe it is difficult to see, but it is a picture found in the archives of Mr. Medici, but so far it has not yet been found. Nobody knows where it is. If you ask Mr. Medici where is the sarcophagus, he tells you, I don't tell you where it is. And of course, we cannot torture Mr. Medici. He has been already convicted to 8 years of imprisonment in Italy. Now he has quite old, 79 years. And so there is somewhere, maybe the owner is a private collector and we do not know where it is. It will be the 3rd Etruscan sarcophagus of spouses of a couple. The other 2, they are in Rome in the Museum of Villa Giulia, where you have also the Euphonious Crater, and the second one is in the Louvre in France. Coming back to my conclusion, one last minute. In my view, an evolutionary trend is developing in customary international law, according to which claims relating to movements of cultural properties not covered by treaties should be addressed in order to achieve an equitable solution, taking into account all the relevant circumstances. There are some circumstances which in certain cases play in favor of the state of destination. In other cases, they play in favor of the state of origin, and the situation has to be balanced according to them. What are the circumstances? The factors surrounding the removal of the cultural properties in particular the legality of the removal of the under the law of the state of origin, or the substantive injustice of the removal according to ethical criteria. In the past we had no rules, so every removal could have been legal. But we have some ethical principle. Maybe the removal was legal at the time when it was effected, but now it is immoral, the retention of the artifact, which was acquired exploiting the weakness of another subject. Then the importance of the cultural properties for the state of origin. For example, the emblematic character of the property. There are cultural properties which are repetitive, so they could be abroad. But what is difficult to accept for certain countries of origin is the export of properties which are emblematic of the culture and of the history of the country. Think about Egypt, for example. Then the harm to the integrity of the cultural context from which the cultural property was removed, the concept of integrity, including ruins, the integrity of sculptures which have been removed from ruins. Then the amount of time since the cultural property was removed from the state of origin. Then the care used to preserve the cultural property by the state of destination. And then the state of origin's commitment to care for the preservation of cultural properties if it were returned to it. So, in my view, today we have to find an equitable solution which could be different depending on the different cases, and we should balance to reach the solution all the different factors. And I thank you very much for your attention.